Okay, so let's dive into Matthew 6:5-6.
Right.
And I think this is something that like every pastor,
Yeah,
has wrestled with how to teach this in
absolutely.
a fresh way.
Right.
Everyone knows the verses, the go to your room and pray bit,
Oh, yeah.
but we've got a stack of sermons and commentaries here.
Okay.
And it's really interesting how many pastors are like going beyond that surface level,
Right. Right.
and finding these like really thought-provoking angles.
Well, and what's fascinating to me is that it's not even just about how to pray.
Yeah.
It's like they're digging into the why behind Jesus even saying this. It's
Right.
like, what was going on back then that made this so radical?
Yeah. And so many of them jump into like the historical context,
Yeah. Yeah.
like who are the Pharisees and why was Jesus so concerned with this, like the public displays of piety?
Right.
Like one pastor even compared it to like someone posting all their charitable donations on social media.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a great modern parallel. And it really makes you think, like, what are the modern day equivalents of those showy prayers that Jesus was calling out?
Exactly.
It's not just about being physically in your room. It's about the heart motive behind it.
Exactly. Life in Westport actually had a really interesting take on this.
Oh, yeah.
They were talking about prayer less as like a formula and more like how you would build any close relationship.
Mm-hmm.
It takes time, it takes vulnerability.
Yeah.
Like you wouldn't just rattle off a list of demands
Right.
to someone you were trying to get to know.
That's such a good point. It totally reframes it. It's
Yeah.
not about performing for God. It's about developing intimacy.
Right.
And that brings us to this whole prayer closet idea.
Yeah.
Central Baptist Church, Dun and C, had this interpretation that really struck me.
Ooh. Tell me more about that one. That's always a tricky image.
Yeah.
To unpack.
So they actually connected it to Ephesians 6,
Okay.
where Paul talks about putting on the armor of God.
Right.
And they were saying the closet's not about hiding. It's like our spiritual armory,
I like that.
where we prepare for spiritual battle.
Yeah. It adds a whole new dimension to it.
Right.
It's not just about finding a quiet place. It's about intentional preparation.
Yes.
Almost like a soldier getting ready for combat.
Exactly. And it speaks to this idea of prayer not being passive, but a powerful force.
Right.
You're equipping yourself for whatever you might face out in the world.
Speaking of facing challenges,
Mm-hmm.
Highland Heights Baptist Church had this quote from Greg Farrell's
Okay.
that really resonated with me.
Yeah.
He said that prayer is about aligning our hearts with God's will, not the other way around.
That's so profound because how often are we trying to get God to do what we want?
Right.
This idea of alignment suggests a much deeper surrender.
Yeah.
You know?
It's not about bending God to our will.
Right.
It's about conforming to his plan,
Exactly.
which honestly is way harder
Oh, yeah.
than just firing off a wish list.
For sure.
And that brings me to something else I noticed in these sources.
Okay.
Just the sheer creativity of the sermon illustrations.
Oh, yeah.
I love the spring cleaning your prayer closet one.
Well, that's a good one.
That one really stood out to me.
It's so relatable, too.
It is.
Because, like, we all have that clutter in our lives, right?
Yes.
But this is applying it to our spiritual lives.
Yeah.
Like, what are the things that are clogging up our connection with God?
Mm.
What anxieties, to-do lists, or distractions are taking up space that should be reserved for him?
It's such a powerful image. And I can see how that would really resonate with a congregation.
Absolutely.
It's practical.
Yeah.
It's actionable.
Yeah.
And it gets you thinking about your prayer life in a whole new way.
And what I love about this particular set of sermons and commentaries is that they don't just offer these clever illustrations.
Right.
They really unpack them and they connect them back to the deeper theological truths
Yes.
behind Matthew 6:5-6.
Yeah, it's not just about being catchy. It's about using those illustrations as a springboard
Yes.
for a deeper reflection and spiritual growth.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes these insights so valuable for pastors and Bible study leaders.
Yeah.
It's not just giving people information.
Right.
You're giving them tools to transform their relationship with God.
I think that's a great point to maybe pause on.
Okay.
We've only just scratched the surface here of what these pastors are unpacking. So let's take a quick break and come back with even more insights and inspiration.
All right. So, picking back up on this idea of fresh perspectives, City on a Hill Church had this take on the prayer closet that almost flipped the script for me.
Oh, really?
Yeah, instead of it being a place of solitude, they presented it as a birthing room.
Interesting.
Their point was that in prayer, something new is being brought forth.
Okay.
So, like, for a new believer, it's where their faith is born.
Right.
But even for seasoned Christians, it can be where fresh vision or commitment is birthed.
I don't know if I fully buy that metaphor.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful image, but I feel like it mostly works for new Christians.
Right.
Like, how does prayer birth something new in someone who's been walking with God for decades?
That's a fair challenge. I think what City on a Hill was getting at is that prayer isn't static.
Okay.
It's not like a one-time event, but an ongoing process of growth and renewal.
Okay.
Even if you've been praying for years, there's always something new God can do in and through you.
So it's less about a single birth and more about that continuous potential for something new to emerge.
Exactly. And I think it highlights the importance of community in the prayer process.
Oh, interesting.
You know how like a midwife supports a mother during labor?
Yeah.
We need each other to support and encourage one another in our prayer journeys.
That's a good point. We often talk about prayer as this individual practice.
Yeah.
But these pastors are reminding us that it's also communal.
It is.
We need that support system.
Absolutely.
That shared experience of seeking God together.
Yeah, and that ties in beautifully with what Calvary Chapel South Bay was talking about.
Okay.
They took that aligning our hearts with God's will idea and went deep on what that actually looks like in practice.
Yeah. That's a concept that's easy to say, but hard to actually live out.
Right.
So what were some of their insights?
They had this powerful illustration of prayer as a tuning fork.
Okay.
You know how a tuning fork vibrates at a specific frequency?
Yeah.
They said our hearts are like that.
Mm.
And spending time with God in prayer is like holding our hearts up to his perfect tuning fork.
Okay.
So we can be realigned to his frequency.
Ooh, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
It really captures that sense of surrender and transformation.
Right. It's not about forcing our will on God.
Right.
It's about allowing him to shape and mold us.
Which isn't always easy, especially when we come to prayer with our own agenda, right? Like, God, please fix this situation, give me this outcome.
Exactly.
But this tuning fork idea suggests a very different posture.
It's about humility, listening, and being open to what God wants to do in our lives, even if it's not what we initially had in mind.
It reminds me of that quote from Richard Foster.
Oh, yeah.
To pray is to change.
Mm.
It's not about changing God's mind. It's about allowing prayer to change us.
And that's where the real power of prayer lies.
Yeah.
When we align ourselves with God's will, we tap into this source of strength, peace, and purpose that goes beyond anything we can achieve on our own.
It's interesting how many of these pastors are highlighting the transformative aspect of prayer.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just about getting our needs met.
Right.
It's about becoming more like Christ.
Absolutely. And that transformation is both personal and communal.
Yeah.
So, like, as individuals, we're being shaped by God's presence.
Right.
But that transformation also spills over
Right.
into our relationships, our communities, and the world around us.
Speaking of community, Life in Westport shared a really powerful story.
Oh, yeah.
About how prayer impacted their congregation.
Yeah.
And it wasn't some big dramatic miracle.
Right.
But it was like a series of small everyday moments where they saw God working through their collective prayers.
I love that they shared something so grounded.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes we get caught up in looking for those mountain-moving prayers.
Right.
But so often it's the faithful, consistent prayers for everyday needs that make the biggest difference.
And those everyday prayers are often the ones that build the strongest bonds.
They do.
Within a community.
Yeah.
When you're praying for each other's families, jobs, struggles, it creates this deep sense of connection and support.
Absolutely. And it cultivates this culture of prayer where it becomes a natural part of life, not just something you do on Sundays or in times of crisis.
Okay, so we've talked about aligning our hearts with God's will.
Yeah.
The transformative power of prayer.
Right.
The importance of community. What else are these pastors unpacking about Matthew 6:5-6?
One theme that kept coming up was this idea of prayer as spiritual warfare.
Okay.
We touched on it earlier with the prayer closet as armory concept.
Right.
But some sources went even deeper with this idea.
I'm always a bit hesitant with that language.
Yeah.
It can feel a bit aggressive.
Right.
You know, like we're battling demons and spiritual forces.
I understand that hesitation, and I think it's important to approach this concept with sensitivity and discernment.
Yeah.
But I also think there's a lot of truth to this idea that we are engaged in a spiritual battle, whether we realize it or not.
Okay, I'm listening.
Yeah.
How are these pastors framing this idea of spiritual warfare in a way that's helpful and not fear-mongering?
So Redeemer Presbyterian Church had a great approach.
Okay.
They talked about how the enemy wants to keep us isolated, discouraged, and distracted from God, and they presented prayer as our primary weapon against those attacks.
So it's less about fighting literal demons and more about fighting those negative thoughts and lies,
right?
Temptations that can keep us from living in God's freedom.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that there are forces at play that want to derail our faith, and prayer is our way of resisting those forces. And staying connected to God's power and protection.
I like that framing a lot better.
Yeah.
It's not about being afraid. It's about being aware and equipped.
Right. And it ties back to that idea of the prayer closet as a place of preparation. It's where we go to put on our spiritual armor, sharpen our swords, and receive our marching orders.
Okay, so we've got spiritual warfare.
Yeah.
What other fresh angles are these pastors bringing to Matthew 6:5-6?
One that really intrigued me was this idea of the prayer closet not being a literal place, but a state of mind.
Ooh, tell me more about that.
So the Village Church talked about how we can create that prayer closet space wherever we are.
Okay.
By intentionally shifting our focus from the distractions around us to the presence of God.
So it's about cultivating that inner sanctuary, that quiet place within ourselves.
Exactly.
Where we can connect with God, even amidst the chaos of daily life.
Right. It's about recognizing that prayer isn't confined to a specific time or location.
Right.
It can be this constant conversation with God that we carry with us throughout the day.
I really like that it makes prayer feel much more accessible and sustainable.
It does.
You know, it's not about finding an hour of uninterrupted solitude.
Right.
It's about those small moments throughout the day where we can pause, breathe, and reconnect with God.
And I think that's a really important message for people who are busy, stressed, feeling like they don't have time for dedicated prayer closet time.
Right.
It's about meeting God in the midst of our everyday lives.
And it speaks to that heart attitude that Jesus was getting at in Matthew 6:5-6.
Exactly.
It's not about the outward appearance, it's about the inner posture of our hearts.
It is. It's about cultivating that constant awareness of God's presence.
Yeah.
And allowing that awareness to shape our thoughts, words, and actions.
You know, one thing that's really striking me about these pastors is their willingness to move beyond those traditional interpretations.
Right.
And really wrestle with what this passage means for us today.
I agree. They're not afraid to challenge assumptions.
Right.
Ask hard questions, offer new ways of understanding this familiar text.
And that's what makes these insights so valuable for other pastors and Bible study leaders.
Absolutely.
It's about going beyond the surface level, digging deeper, and finding those fresh perspectives.
Yes.
That can breathe new life into our preaching and teaching.
Right. It's about helping people to connect with God in a way that's authentic and meaningful and transformative. And I think these pastors are doing a phenomenal job of that.
I couldn't agree more. We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From the historical context to the transformative power of prayer to the importance of community and spiritual warfare.
And we still got more to unpack.
We do.
Let's take another quick pause and then come back to explore some more of these incredible insights.
Okay, so we're back. And, you know, going through all these sermons and commentaries, I keep coming back to this one question, like, what actually makes for a good sermon on this passage?
Yeah.
It's so easy to fall into cliches.
It is.
But these pastors have really raised the bar.
What I think is so impressive is that they're not just offering these like clever interpretations. They're giving us this framework for understanding the heart of what Jesus was teaching.
Exactly.
And they're doing it in a way that's both theologically sound and practically relevant.
Yeah, like take that prayer as a tuning fork analogy.
Right.
It's a beautiful image.
It is.
But it's also a challenge.
Yeah.
Like, how do we actually do that? How do we help our congregations align their hearts with God's will?
So Calvary Chapel South Bay had some really practical suggestions for that.
Okay.
They emphasized the importance of listening in prayer. Not just rattling off our requests, but being still quieting our minds and truly listening for God's voice.
That's so crucial and so easily overlooked.
It is. We're so used to treating prayer like this one-way conversation.
Right.
But these pastors are reminding us that it's a dialogue.
It is.
It's about receiving as much as it is about asking.
And that receptivity is key to that heart alignment.
Yeah.
You know, it's about being open to God's guidance, even if it's not what we expect or want.
Which can be tough, right? Especially when we come to God with our own agenda.
Oh, absolutely.
But these pastors are pushing us to surrender our will to His.
Right.
To trust that He knows what's best for us.
And that surrender, that trust, is what allows for true transformation to take place.
Yeah.
It's not about us trying to manipulate God.
Yeah.
It's about letting him work in and through us.
One source that really drove that point home was the River Church.
Yeah.
They shared this story about a woman in their congregation who had been praying for years for her prodigal son to return home. And she finally realized that her prayers were more about her own pain and longing than about her son's well-being.
That's such a poignant example.
It's so easy to get caught up in our own desires, even in prayer.
Right.
But this woman's story reminds us that true prayer is about aligning our hearts with God's heart, even when it hurts.
And that can be a messy, uncomfortable process.
It can be.
But it's also where the real growth happens.
It is.
You know, it's where we learn to trust God's wisdom and timing, even when it doesn't make sense to us.
Absolutely. And as we surrender to his will, as we allow him to transform our hearts, that's when we become more like Christ.
Right.
And that's the ultimate goal of prayer, isn't it?
Yeah.
To be conformed to his image.
Absolutely. And that transformation is not just for our own benefit.
Right.
Redeemer Presbyterian Church actually talk about this. They said, as we become more like Christ, we become more effective agents of his grace and love in the world.
It's like this ripple effect. The more we're aligned with God's will, the more our lives reflect his character, and the more impact we have on the people around us.
And that impact can take many forms, right?
Oh, for sure.
It's not always about preaching from a pulpit or leading a Bible study.
Right.
It's about the way we live our lives, the way we love our neighbors, the way we speak truth and grace into the world.
Exactly. And that's why I found this whole deep dive so inspiring.
Yeah.
These pastors aren't just giving us like tips on how to preach a better sermon.
Right.
They're challenging us to live out the truth of Matthew 6:5-6.
Yes.
In every aspect of our lives.
And they're giving us the tools to help our congregations do the same.
They are.
You know, they're reminding us that prayer is not just this religious duty.
Right.
It's a lifeline to God.
It is.
It's a source of strength, guidance, transformation.
And it's a privilege.
It is.
To be invited into this intimate relationship with the creator of the universe.
Yeah.
It's a gift that we should cherish and cultivate both individually and communally.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this challenge.
Okay.
Go back to Matthew 6:5-6.
Right.
Read it again, but this time don't just read the words. Let them sink into your heart. Ask God to show you what it means for you, for your ministry.
Yeah.
For the people you're called to lead.
Because when we truly grasp the power of prayer, when we embrace it as this vital part of our relationship with God, everything changes.
It does.
Our perspective shifts, our priorities realign, and we become more like the people he created us to be.
And that's what makes this passage so timeless and so relevant for us today.
It does.
It's not just a set of instructions.
Right.
It's an invitation into a deeper, richer, more fulfilling life with God.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes.
We hope you found it as enriching and challenging as we have.
And until next time, keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the Word of God.